Musical Talk, the UK independent musical theatre podcast.
The lark is singing on high, the suns are shining.
That great writer Julian Fellowes is a huge fan of Ivor Novello's, and so on the show I have a man in the know, and we'll start with a couple of hellos.
Hello.
Hello.
Well, that's me, Thos, and I was joined by Dr. Michael Williams, who is a world expert on the career of Ivor Novello. Because today on Musical Talk, I'm very pleased to be able to say we're going to bring you a fascinating interview, both with Dr. Williams and with Julian Fellowes, who for us in the world of Musical Talk is probably best known for writing the screenplay of Gosford Park, which features Ivor Novello, a hugely influential British musical theatre giant of the early 20th century, and also for writing the book for the revised version of Mary Poppins, which of course has music by the Sherman Brothers and Styles and Drew, and which has been a huge success in London and the rest of the world. But it's also fitting that now, as we commemorate 90 years since the end of the First World War, the Great War, that we should be discussing Ivor Novello, who wrote the great anthemic song of that period, the first of many songs that he would write as a great composer of musical theatre in Britain until his death in 1951.
Keep the bonfires burning while your hearts are yearning. Oh, your lads are far away, they dream of home. There's a silver lining through the dark cloud shining. Turn the dark cloud inside out till the boys come home.
So today on this show, what you'll get is a discussion between myself and Michael Williams about the importance of Ivor Novello. And then you'll hear the discussion with Julian Fellowes about Gosford Park. And then later on, Michael Williams and I will be summing up the career of Ivor Novello again in the light of the comments you'll have heard from the interview with Julian Fellowes. I do hope you'll enjoy today's programme. Musical Talk. Well, as I said earlier, I was joined by Dr. Michael Williams, who is a world expert on the career of Ivor Novello. He's the author of the book Ivor Novello Screen Idol, which was published by the British Film Institute, and he's a Doctor of Film Studies at the University of Southampton. We started our discussion by talking about Ivor Novello and his significance in World War I culture. So, Michael, just to frame this a little bit, if I were to say Ivor Novello to people in the streets today, what would most people be thinking of?
Most people would know the Ivor Novello Music Award, first and foremost, which they would hear about every year, know about the nominees, the Amy Winehouses and the like, though many people wouldn't actually know who Ivor Novello was, though that has changed since Gosford Park, in that if I'm now talking about Ivor Novello to someone, and you get that look across the face about who it is, but now the trigger is to say Gosford Park and it clicks and they know who it is. So things have shifted over the last few years.
So in a way that's moving back to his role in the 20th century as a great, well, almost a Renaissance man, as a writer of musical theatre reviews really, but also appearing in films, which is the area that you specialise in. So it's quite fitting in a way that Gosford Park fused those two things together, because the character is the only real character that's featured in that screenplay. And he does sing songs, which is one of the reasons I think we're interested in that today.
That's right. I mean, he was always a kind of cross-media personality, if you want to see it that way, anyway, certainly in the 20s.
One of the first, would you say?
He certainly pioneered it. I mean, if you think about the mid-20s, I mean, we may talk about The Rat later, but one of his plays, and also Downhill was another play he wrote, then became a Hitchcock film in 1927. But at the time, it was seen as somewhat pioneering that he toured the country with the West End production and went around it publicising both the stage version but at the same time the films he was appearing in, which resulted in these outbursts of hysteria among his admirers, and there are much publicised and exaggerated incidents, particularly around Manchester, where it talked about sort of flappers with their hearts aflutter and gathered around his car, kissing the wheels of his tyres, the tyres of his cars, trying to get close to their idol. And that was designed to, showcase himself, the work he did, but certainly stage and screen at the same time, and also downhill. It's an interesting example, because when that was staged in London, that for some production there was a moment when the film was shown that the screen at one point would kind of raise, revealing Novello on stage.
Really?
In person. So there's a real hybrid there, playing between the theatre and the film, what that can do. Obviously playing to the appeal he had for particularly female, but not exclusively, audiences as well. The scene where it's a kind of shower sequence where he's kind of washing his feet was apparently the bit that the press really picked up on. So again, playing to his sex appeal for audiences there.
And there are photographs of him from various films of the 1920s with him shirtless, aren't there? Which is actually quite forward for the period.
It is, yes. In Downhill, there's a moment where he's taken by surprise in the shower, as it were.
Thank you, Your Honour.
There's a scene where as the doors have opened and one of the female cast kind of spies him there, and he quickly covers himself up in sort of embarrassment. If you think of the mid-20s, the big stars around then, Valentino, who he's certainly competing against, and Ramon Navarro on the rise then as well. He hasn't got their kind of sculptured physiques that the American stars had in particular, but it was certainly there for the delight of the audience.
Made to look throwaway, but actually extremely deliberate.
Yeah, it seemed to be important. All those press reports about the kind of the washing himself on stage thing shows that actually was there for that particular reason. And also in Triumph of the Rat, the second Rat film from 1926, there's a moment where Novello is kind of assaulted by a rival Apache. And there's a moment where the scene slightly reframes itself, and suddenly the shirt is hanging open on Novello to kind of reveal his left nipple, conveniently where the knife is now approaching. So again, there's a moment of kind of revealing there, which is motivated by the plot, but nonetheless it's there for the audience.
You might argue that he's one of the first fully aware, self-developing, self-referential stars, certainly in British theatrical history. And you've touched upon his films and you've touched upon his stage plays. Now, none of those were musical. Of course, the films were actually silent. But he was already known for writing music in that period because he'd written the great anthem of the First World War with his mother, Keep the Home Fires Burning, which is a song you do still hear today occasionally. And it made him a household name in 1916, I think.
Yes, that's right. So 1915 to 16, Keep the Home Fires Burning, that really made him a household name. And there's one Christmas during the First World War where if you look in the press for a number of months, almost every issue has some reference to Keep the Home Fires Burning on it, and many of them reproduce the kind of lyrics and music on the whole of the front pages of them, so that the kind of soldiers coming back from the front and also those at home, because the song importantly links both of those. It's about the loved ones thinking about the troops away in France, but it's also about those in France sort of wistfully thinking about the home as well. And the song worked because it wasn't overly optimistic, it was wistful. It was somehow reassuring about the qualities of home, about thinking of each other, but at the same time it did realise that things weren't right and they wouldn't necessarily turn out right either, which I think is quite important for Novello's persona, and that he's often perceived to be a very...
Romantic?
Oh yes, overly romantic, someone that isn't really relevant to their period, where actually I would argue that the opposite was true, that there is a wistfulness to many of his songs that often correspond to particular historical moments when that quality of uncertainty and a need for reassurance, a need for some other quality, was where he could step in and offer that. And I think that's often lost in the way he's looked back upon. There in 1916, if you look at what was happening with that song, almost every pantomime incorporated it, whether it's Puss in Boots. You'll find accounts of whole theatres filled with injured soldiers, for example, which happened, singing Keep the Home Fires Burning at a particular moment in the pantomime, and accounts how they're all in tears singing this song, which is a really kind of mix. At the same time it's joyful, but at the same time there's a real kind of sense of tragedy about it, it's uncertainty, which is quite interesting.
So he went straight in, essentially, in his music writing career. I mean, that's the song, that's very early on in his life, let alone his career, with an absolute corking hit. I mean, obviously, in the context of the First World War, that would help.
Yes.
And as you say, it was performed in pantomimes. It was also very quickly assimilated by the music halls of the period, who, at the time, because there was no BBC or broadcasting, for entertainment, you went to the theatre or the music halls, and so that was another way. All the songs that have been handed down to us from the First World War, in many ways, are popularised in the music halls. So a long way from Tipperary, and as you say, Keep the Home Fires Burning had its own dynamic, but was certainly incorporated into the music halls.
I mean, just to add there, what also helped with Novello was his image at the time, because around 1915, 16, you've also got Rupert Brooke, as a kind of icon of that period, who himself was promoted very strongly by Edward Marsh, who compiled all the Georgian poets anthologies, and that famous image of him you see on the inside cover. If you now look in the second-hand bookshops and find an edition of the Georgian poets or the collected poems of Rupert Brooke, you see this particular image of this very handsome, youthful figure who we know to have died in 1916. So it's kind of a lost youth emblem for the First World War. And if you look at the way that Novello was promoted when the papers were talking about Keep the Home Fires Burning, there is a similarity in the way that his photographic image was framed then, a certain type of slightly open-necked shirt. He was shown in profile. Novello's profile was very famous, was the famous thing about his image. You often see him turn to the side in the framing in a way that Brooke was similarly. And Novello himself had associations with Edward Marsh. Edward Marsh is kind of patron of the arts who took Rupert Brooke under his wing beforehand. Later on, Christopher Hassel as well, who also worked with Novello.
He was one of the lyricists for Ivor Novello, wasn't he?
Yes, and
indeed he wrote the lyrics to one of the famous songs And Her Mother Came Too, which is one of Ivor Novello's famous comic numbers.
That's right, yes.
But you were saying?
And Edward Marsh, having already taken Rupert Brooke under his wing, then later worked on editing his anthologies, then took Novello under his wing as well, which is an interesting juxtaposition in terms of how Novello's known now as this very romantic, the kind of the lush operettas that he
almost
presented.
sentimental, in fact. Yes.
Yeah. Then if you place him in the same world as not just Brooke but also Secret Sassoon, in that kind of whole collection of kind of war poets, the kind of the avant-garde of the
and with whom he's at least alleged to have had an affair.
That's right. They did have an affair, it seems. I mean, if you look in Secret Sassoon's diaries, you see there's a kind of gap, and Sassoon is said to have said after the affair that I despise Novello and all he stands for, which is quite interesting.
Except when he was over me.
Yeah, and if you look in Novello's guest book, if you go into the Theatre Museum archive, you can see it's got everyone who signed in. Gladys Cooper rolls in very early in the morning sometimes. You can see Secret Sassoon's signature there as well. So he was obviously there at that particular moment. It does correspond with the blank pages in Sassoon's diary. But there is an interesting tension there. So Marsh was trying to include Novello into this collection of sort of upcoming artists, and he hoped that Novello would become a great writer in that vein, and he had him do readings of Sassoon's poetry. Novello also composed settings for poems at the same time, and that really jarred with Sassoon, who felt that there was a certain kind of ragtime note to what Novello was doing, which jarred with Sassoon as well. So there's obviously an attraction there on some level, but there's also an artistic
antagonism, yes.
Antagonism, but it obviously didn't work out that way. I mean, I also heard that there were plans to develop a kind of biopic, a film biopic of Rupert Brooke's life, and I've heard that Marsh had in mind Novello for that role at one point, which is another kind of connection to that particular period. So, but things didn't carry on in that vein. But I would argue that when you look at the films of the 20s, and to some extent the music as well, the way that plays into this sort of slightly kind of melancholic air, a nostalgia for a past that didn't really exist, but it's kind of hopeful, but at the same time it's very clear that it didn't exist or couldn't exist, this sense of impossible romance as well. If you look in films such as The Lodger, the Alfred Hitchcock film from 1926, the whole character he plays there somehow embodies this whole sort of post-war context where there's a changed masculinity there that's somehow conveying through this kind of very neurotic, nervous performance that he has there, some tensions involved in the context, because Novello himself was so strongly associated with the First World War himself through the song, but also this sexual ambiguity at the same time, the sense that in The Lodge he plays the eponymous lodger of the film who arrives at the Bunting house.
This is one of the first great Hitchcock films, in fact, it has to be said.
Hitchcock looked back on it and said, this is my first Hitchcock film, in the way he would.
Much more slowly.
Indeed. So Novello there is playing this person who's suspected of possibly being the Avenger, who's this murderer abroad on the foggy London streets who kills blonde women, of course.
A kind of Jack the Ripper.
Exactly, yes, very much in that vein. So Novello's there as this kind of suspect figure who may be this murder, and there's a kind of sexual edge to it as well, because he's killing these blonde women, and we don't quite know what's happening there. So he's already this sexually suspect figure. He's also nervous and neurotic, and if you combine that with Novello's own homosexuality, which, while wasn't really explicitly voiced, was nonetheless there. As always said that those in his, obviously, theatrical circles knew very well.
Yes. Those who knew.
Exactly. But of course, when you look back in the past, it's very difficult to find traces, evidence for that when you make readings. Although Yes, the New York Times, when it reviewed the film a year later, I guess as close as you could do in terms of alluding to Novello's sexuality, and said the now enters Mr. Novello looking pale and drawn and with a manner plainly saying that he very likely doesn't care for blondes at all. Which I think you can't get much bolder than that, really. So it's
just on the right side of libel at the time.
Yeah, exactly. So it's indicating there's a kind of, if you like, camp manner, or a performance style that is alluding to these kind of social, if you want to call it, traumas of the time in terms of the effects of the war and post-war masculinity in the 1920s. If you think of how many people were injured at that time, and the nervous illnesses in particular were increasing as the 20s went on. Combine that with this sexual edge as well. There's this kind of slightly indeterminate edge to Novello there.
Sexually ambiguous Heathcliff is really what we're getting, I think, the way you're describing it.
Yes, he's a figure, a very paradoxical kind of figure that is the big star of the time in terms of the way he appeals to audiences. And I mean, if you look at The Lodger, these kind of great, big, glowing, luminous close-up kisses, as seen when Novello approaches ever close to the camera, it looks like he's about to swallow it at one point. And the idea is that you're there in the mind of Daisy, the character played by June, that Novello's approaching you and is going to kiss you.
So not so much filmed in CinemaScope, but in Endoscope, by the sounds of it.
Almost, yeah. So he's this real figure of desire and passion, but at the same time he's there as a possible murderer, possible sex crimes around him as well. He's kind of neurotic, nervous, all those possible things.
And just touching on his homosexuality
exactly,
as well.
And all those things are kind of bound up together very ambiguously. Hitchcock, in his own way, when he gradually rewrites his own biography in every interview that he does, kind of indicates, it's difficult with Novello. He was such a big star at the time. Of course, Hitchcock wasn't. And if you look at the way The Lodger was reviewed, they're constantly misspelling his name. They don't really know who Hitchcock is. He's just
he's just a director.
He's just a director.
Yes.
Novello was the big thing at the time, and Hitchcock may have been a tension there. But Hitchcock said it's difficult. He's a star, and they're limited with what you can do with a star. But obviously, actually, Novello brings so much more to that role. And it's very easy to be critical of that kind of role. Just look back, as indeed on silent film as well. So many prejudices bound up with that you look on a film like that and say, it's very clanky, it's over-mannered. You'll hear Novello described as mannered, and theatrical is another word that always...
In a damning sense.
Exactly, yes. Without looking at what's really going on there, how does this chime in with the period itself? What about Novello is being brought to that role? There's so much more there, if you could be bothered to look for it, really.
That's absolutely fascinating, because what's bizarre is you've painted for us a picture of Ivor Novello as a household name in nearly almost every aspect of the theatrical world he touches, by which I mean he was a star in films, successfully with The Lodger, although later on his career goes off the boil a bit, and that's referred to in Gosford Park. He's a big name in terms of writing songs. I mean, he's written the hit of the First World War, but he wrote shows. In 1917 he wrote a musical called Theodore and Company, and... He's big in the theatre. He's big writing musicals. He's writing songs. He's appearing in films. There's pretty much, and this is before radio. Radio really starts broadcasting in this country in the 20s. So he's a star before that and continues to be a star throughout the 20s and all the way up to his death in 1951. But what's odd in Gosford Park is, of course, he impresses the staff below stairs because everybody knows who he is. But he's actually nobody in the upper class circles of Gosford Park. He has to get his way into that particular milieu. This is the fictional Ivor Novello, but of course, in a way, it's reflecting of the time, that he actually gets in by being a distant relative of a member of the aristocracy. That's his entrance into that particular world. And of course, there's a whole raft of things where he's observing them so that he can copy them. He's got this sort of Noel Coward thing going on. In fact, Noel Coward is the man who's most often sort of quoted as the parallel to Ivor Novello of this period, in the sense that they're both very successful in various spheres, and both slightly coming from modest backgrounds, attempting to seem a bit posher than they actually are. And you see that quite clearly in Gosford Park. Now, in a minute, we'll go over to the Julian Fellowes interview, but just to say briefly before we move in, Gosford Park is important because, for us as fans of musical theatre and musicals, that Ivor Novello, or Jeremy Northam, who plays Ivor Novello, sings many of the songs that Ivor Novello had made famous. So, if you see Gosford Park, do listen out for those songs and you'll get a feel for the kind of thing that Ivor Novello did. But perhaps it would be interesting now to move over to Julian Fellowes, famous actor, famous playwright, and in this case a teleplay or screenplay writer for Gosford Park.
Musical Talk, the UK independent musical theatre podcast. Thank you very much, Julian, for agreeing to speak to Musical Talk. You're probably best known as the book writer for Mary Poppins, but you also do have, if I may say, a connection into musical theatre through a particular individual who you placed in the screenplay of your excellent film Gosford Park, and that's Ivor Novello.
Ivor Novello.
And I think it's fair to say that you have almost single-handedly re-kick-started his career, which had been languishing somewhat. I suppose I really wanted to ask, why Ivor Novello first? What was the draw?
Well, I'd love to take credit for it, as I would for almost anything, but the truth is that Ivor Novello was in Gosford Park because of Bob Altman. And what had happened was I'd written the kind of first draft of the movie, and we had the plot of I don't know if you've seen the film, but the false actor who is playing the valet and the Weissman, the film producer, and so on. That was all in. And I think originally he'd got into the house because he was a friend of William McCordle or something. I can't remember now, but it wasn't as good. And then I went over to California to work on the script for a couple of days with Robert Altman. And he decided he wanted to have practical music as opposed to just soundtrack. And he felt that Ivor Novello had been very much overlooked and rather unfairly forgotten, unlike, Noel Coward and so on. So he wanted to use Ivor Novello so he could use his music. And obviously I could see at once that this would be a much better introduction for the show business plot if we made Ivor Novello the reason they were there, because he was a sort of bridge between England and show business in narrative terms. Bob said, we'll make him a cousin of Sylvia. I said, no, I don't think he was a cousin of Sylvia, but he might be a cousin of William. So, in fact, he becomes William's first cousin, and their mothers are sisters, or I forget now, which, of course, was quite right, because then that also served the McCordle story, that you realise he'd come a long way and so on. Anyway, I came home to England, and I started to read a biography of Ivor Novello, and I assumed up till then that he would have to be a kind of the big I Am character, like Flarepath or something like that, where the movie star comes in and so on. And then I realised it was actually much more interesting than that, because we had decided already, long before, that the time that the film was taking place was November 1932. And the reason for this is we wanted that way of life more or less at its last gasp, at the end before the war. I said it had to be a sporting weekend. It had to revolve around sport for those people. And, basically that's either hunting or shooting in that context. And shooting is better if you want the women and so on, blah, blah.
Yeah, the fishing of it is always less interesting, isn't it?
Yes, and slight fishing house parties I don't think rings very true. So we'd gone for shooting, and that pushed us into the winter. Bob didn't want Christmas because he just felt it was kind of a cliche to see Christmas trees and all that stuff. And neither of us wanted the Nazis, because in almost every film in the 30s, there's some great subtext about the Nazis, and we just felt that had been done. And because the Nazis burnt down the Reichstag in January 1933, we felt that November 32 was the last time when feasibly nobody would talk about the government in Germany. So we were pinned to a very specific time. And when I read the book on Ivor Novello, I realised that this particular period was a very, very interesting one for a screenwriter or dramatist point of view, because Ivor Novello had been a very successful songwriter and Keep the Home Fires Burning and all the rest of it.
The song of the First World War.
The song of the First World War. But then he'd gone into performing, and he had become a movie star, film star, and in very much that kind of Rudolph Valentino vein, that rather Latin beauty, as opposed to a kind of butch young man. But nevertheless, and he was very successful. And then with the coming of sound, his career had dipped, as so many did. I mean, nowadays you always hear people saying that's because their voices weren't good. But of course it wasn't always that. In fact, it wasn't that in most cases. What it was is that sound created a reality demand that was different to the pantomimic entertainment of the silent screen. And what they wanted was James Cagney and Mae Marsh and these very real people suddenly enacting dramas, as opposed to the almost balletic business of the silent movie. And so people like Pola Negri or whatever it was belonged in that other tradition. But anyway, of course it's easy to say these things long after the event. And at the time, some people, some Ronald Coleman or Madeleine Carroll or whatever, were getting through. And they all were thinking, what can I do that will revive my career? And Novello had this tremendous success with a silent movie called The Lodger.
by Alfred Hitchcock.
Well, that was the key factor. He didn't really understand that the important detail was it had been directed by a young Alfred Hitchcock. So his idea was he would remake The Lodger as a talkie, and of course it would be immensely successful, and then he would be off and away. But of course he didn't get Hitchcock or anyone like him. Anyway, I would maintain that he wasn't right anyway for the films of that time, but anyway, he made it. And the picture came out in the summer of 32 and was an absolute flop. Went straight down the pan. And although I think he did make another couple of films to complete his contract, his film career was over. And he was a very bright man. He knew it was over. There was no sort of fooling around, you know. And that's the whole dialogue, you know, with Maggie Smith. And she must be so disappointed when something just flops like that. And,
yes, it is rather, I believe, is that.
Well, and at that time, in November 32, he was in the middle of this, I always hesitate to use words like depression, which have been sort of taken by our modern, rather self-important age, but nevertheless, it was a very down period for him, because he thought what he was looking at was losing all his celebrity, losing his stardom, and going back to being a songwriter. Well, you know, there are worse fates on earth, but nevertheless, when you have been a great star, that was quite hard. And, I mean, we now know that the great musical shows and Glamorous Nights and For Chance to Dream, the dancing years was all to come. But, of course, he didn't know that. And suddenly this character, instead of being this great egomaniac, became this rather depressed, doubting figure that some of them regarded as a great star, like Mabel.
Indeed.
And Lady Trentham, of course, thought was rather common and a bore and so on. And that makes him much more interesting dramatically, because he has this kind of self-undermine. I mean, that moment when Weissman says to him, "How can you stand these people?" And he says, "You forget I make my living impersonating them," is very self-abnegating. So as soon as I'd read that, I thought, oh, well, this is actually a much more interesting addition to the cast. And then we went into the music. And actually, all the music, we were pretty rigorous, not for the theme of the movie, which I think is Waltz of My Heart. But
the opening section with Lady Trentham's car in the rain.
As it comes in, is Waltz of My Heart. But all the songs he actually plays are pre-November 1932, with the sole exception of a phrase of Waltz of My Heart, because it hadn't then been selected for the film. You know, we were making the picture. And I've always liked it. And I thought, well, I'm going to put this in, but of course it hadn't come out. I mean, it was years later. And so there's a moment when Sylvia says, "What are you playing? I don't think I know that." And he says, "Oh, it's just something I've been fiddling with." Oh. And this is the premise, that every composer has a drawer full of ideas that they haven't fully developed. And so that's how I got round it.
So how well did you know his canon, shall we say?
Well, I knew sort of some of the big ones, you know. I think the problem for the Novello revival, which I have to say, I'm very glad came out of Gosford. There were a tremendous renewed interest, and, you know, they re-recorded. Jeremy Northam himself did a recording, I think, of Novello, and all of that, I think, was absolutely great. But his librettos are really not suitable to this generation. They are very sentimental. They have very little narrative. They're not very funny. They're not witty. No. It's mainly some wretched princess, you know, sobbing away on the cliff top. And the other problem with the scores are they are almost all ballads. It's just ballad after ballad after ballad after ballad. And there was an idea at one time of the three of us who did the music for Mary Poppins, George Stiles and Anthony Drew, who did the music and lyrics, and I, possibly reworking one of the Novello musicals, but we weren't really allowed to alter. You know, it's always that thing when they say you can do what you like, but of course you can't do what you like. And I'm not really fighting that. I mean, they feel they have to protect his memory and everything, which is okay by me.
But it is languishing.
Well, the difficulty is I just don't think. I think the Guardians are unrealistic in thinking that there is a market for them as they are written beyond the amateur. And until they bite on the bullet, that they have to be completely restructured and rewritten. And then you have to find numbers that can be chorus numbers, numbers that can be point numbers, all of this stuff. The other thing is that, of course, Novello couldn't sing. I mean, the only real cheat we do in Gosford Park is he has a beautiful singing voice, which is not the case. He did play and accompany himself at the odd country house, although he was never, which I hope is clear in the film, he has a reason to be there, which is to bring his friend in. He was never a country house crawler like Coward or some of the others. He was very unsnobbish, funnily enough, Novello. He was interested in show business, and he liked knowing all the stars and all the people of the day and so on. But he wasn't, I mean, you know, I suppose everyone at that time particularly but likes the odd duchess at their dinner table. But he wasn't one of his great motivators, social advancement. He wasn't a snob in that way. He wasn't a creep in that way, but of course what he couldn't do anyway was sing. And he played a bit, but it was more to kind of do comic numbers. He would do Mother Came Too or something, which is a half Rex Harrison spoken number.
And possibly the one he's still most remembered for.
It's a good song, actually.
And that is the genuinely funny one, I think, in his canon.
Some of the funny ones aren't funny. I mean, the one I resisted, rather, and I wish we hadn't used, was If You Wonder What a Duke would be, or something, which I think is as funny as cold porridge. But anyway, we cheated on that, and we made the singer good. But the point of that is that his character in all King's Rhapsody, you know, Glamorous Nights, The Dancing Years, whatever, his character never sings. Because very early on he gave himself, I think, one song, and it was a flop every night. And he took it out. And again, I think nowadays, if one was mounting the show, you would have to alter that and give some musical value to the part of the male lead. But I mean, you know, all of that means changing it.
I have to ask, do you feel any personal affinity with Novello? And the reason I ask, forgive me, it's the most appalling cod psychological question. That very line you quoted about, I spend a great deal of my time impersonating them, and I hope you'll forgive me when I say you're probably best known, in Britain at least, partly for your appearances as a member of the aristocracy in Monarch of the Glen. And also, forgive me, you write and you create, but you seem to be an acute observer of the people you portray. And Ivor Novello, in the film, you've cleverly written him in such a way as he's the one who's licensed. He's not a fraud, but he's a licensed impersonator. When you've got other non-licensed impersonators in that plot, people pretending to be who they aren't, across the spectrum, in fact.
Well, everyone is impersonating something, if it's only themselves. You try to put forward a facsimile of yourself as a working, functional being, as opposed to a silent scream. And, I think that's part of being alive. I mean, I have acquired this reputation as a sort of Silver Fork chronicler. And because nobody else is, after the job at the moment, I have a fairly open field at it. I think I am rather interested by them. I'm interested by the privileged, because a privileged life is perceived as uncomplicated when you are not part of that world, whereas of course all lives are complicated, and all lives require compromises and the concealment of weakness and the manifestation of the required virtues and all of this stuff. And that's as true if you're in the old days, growing up in a mining community, and you have the pressure to go down the mine, and it's not really what you want, but you have to somehow pretend it is, and all this stuff. There is no different, really, in that to some girl being pushed into a debutante's ball when all she wants to do is run and hide. And we forget that, because we're in this anti-posh post-war era where the politicians encourage us constantly to denigrate all but one set of problems. We have this very simplistic view of life, I think, at the moment, that, if you have enough money, then you have no troubles, or something like that. And I think, anyway, the minutiae of certain privileged existences is rather entertaining. As for my own qualifications, I mean, when I sort of started, when I was a young man, and I would, in those days there was a season, a debutante season song, and young men would get sort of picked up to do it, by this rather extraordinary old character called Peter Townend, who really ran it by then, because it was post-royal presentation. It was after that. And I went in, but I was a very kind of junior member. I mean, I was sort of in that world, but at the bottom end of it. And I think that's a better position to observe. I think when you're a very senior member, if you were one of the great catches of the year, you know, you have this tremendously velvet-gloved treatment. But that was never me. I mean, I was always, you know, in the room next to Nanny with the lumpy bed. And so nobody made a fuss at me or laughed at my jokes when they weren't funny. And I think that you do get a sort of rather, not jaundiced exactly, but I think you get a kind of detailed view of them. And then I went into the theatre, I mean, you know, which was a departure, more of a departure then than it would be now, I think. I mean, this is, I'm talking, you know, whatever, 40 years or 35 years ago. And it was still considered pretty mad. But after I'd sort of gone through that, I very much dropped out of the world I grew up in when I was in the theatre at the beginning. But after a few years, I came back to London in the West End, and it was kind of fun, actually, for some of my old friends to find they knew someone in a play at the Comedy Theatre, you know. So suddenly I started to pick them all up again. They weren't interested when I was suffering in rep, you know, it was just boring and mad. But except for a few locals who would just do my laundry. I mean, I've always lived a kind of slightly schizophrenic, kind of dichotomous life in this area. I mean, I remember when I was in Northampton Rep, you know, and I was living on £18 a week, and I was really living on £18 a week because my parents were quite supportive, but they wouldn't give me any allowance. They said, no, if you can't make this work, then let's find out sooner rather than later. And then there was a sort of huge, great house nearby where I'd been at school with the eldest son and the mother, very, very nice woman, actually. And I used to go out there and be sort of fed up, you know, with this wonderful food, and then my laundry would be done, also wrapped in tissue. And then I'd go back to this cobbler's cottage in Northampton where we used to kind of huddle around the gas fire for heat. And there was something rather entertaining, actually, about going in and out of the world. But again, it reinforces one's sense of being an observer. And I think that I wrote this novel called Snobs, and I was looking at it the other day for something else, and the narrator is, you very much get the sense that he's a sort of insider-outsider, that he knows these people and he likes them and he's known them for a long time, but at the same time he's sort of slightly outside what their life experience is. And I suppose that is what I feel, really. I mean, I also, you know, Oscar Wilde said of education, you know, ignorance is an exotic flower, touch it and the bloom is gone. And the same is really true, I think, of a privileged life, that when you never come out of it, you have one view of it all. But when circumstance takes you outside, either a career or, in many cases, of course, as I used to hear from my mother, the war for a lot of these men and women was a very learning experience, and they became not friendly. I think, you know, often people are either friendly or not friendly. I don't think it has much to do with class, but they were working alongside. They had good friends who came from very different backgrounds to them because of the war. And I think a lot of them never quite went back to the state of almost innocence that they had existed in before.
The state of your grace.
I remember my mother actually saying to me that she suddenly found that she was worrying about thing, were they comfortable? You know, it was were the curtains, or whereas in the 20s, when she was a girl, or 30s, she just didn't really think like that. I mean, not, you know, they were very friendly. I mean, she always liked the people who worked for her parents or whatever, but they just didn't think in the same way. And I mean, I do believe there's a moment in Gosford, which is, you know, quite deliberate. And I was at one point I thought, oh, I hope they get this. When she says, oh, no, I want that shirt. I'll wear that shirt tomorrow for shooting. And the maid has to go and just wash it at midnight, just iron it, and she comes in with the breakfast and this thing. And she's had this horrible experience when she was washing it, of finding the other two. And the whole thing's been incredibly traumatic. And then she comes in and Lady Trentham says, oh, I don't think I will wear it. And you know, when I first saw it in the cinema, the whole cinema audience went, oh. I thought, oh, I'm so pleased because they've got that. And for my money, I mean, the socialist propaganda likes always to make these people very cruel and unkind. And I don't think that was generally the case. I think it was generally lack of thought. It was lack of empathy. It was just a kind of silly thoughtlessness that made them say, oh, I think we don't know, we won't have it after, whole thing's been taken 4 hours to get ready, whatever. And that, I think, was a fault, which you still see, actually. But hopefully, if people could be induced, now I am being a fantasist, but if people could be induced to be more thoughtful, then I think a good deal of the difficulties might evaporate.
I regret that may be a human nature issue and not actually
I'm
confined to one
afraid it
class.
is, yes.
Just taking us back briefly to Novello, if I may, I would like to talk briefly about the afterlife, which, as I say, you I think have been responsible for. I know you've kindly offered it to Robert Altman, but how have you been approached personally by Ivor Novello enthusiasts? Do people want to sort of commandeer your interest or apparent interest in Ivor Novello to revitalise him?
Yes, a bit. The main approach was whether or not I would work on the libretto and there could be a relaunch and a show could be fully and properly mounted again in London. And I would have loved that, actually. I was very enthusiastic, and so were George and Ants, and the idea was we would be allowed to raid some of the other scores. Yes. But the idea was that we would take some other songs, and also some songs that were not from shows, to create chorus numbers and so on, the other demands. But as I say, in the end, they just couldn't really see that the show needed to be changed. And I don't think, I think in 10 years or something, probably they will see that. Because I personally do not believe that you will see a major mounting of a Novello show until they believe that. But, when it happens, the public will be the winners, because some of the music is perfectly marvellous. And I would like to have been part of that, but I think I probably won't be now. But I'm glad to think I've been part of heading in that direction.
Can I ask, forgive me, just on the top of that, whether you get adoring letters from American women of a certain age? And the reason I ask is because a close friend of mine wrote a very learned book on Ivor Novello's film career, as it happened. Quite densely written, excellently researched, but it's not a pick-it-up kind of book. And he has had nothing but appreciative emails and letters from, as I say, women of a certain age who I think have always attached themselves to the Ivor Novello dream.
How thrilling. I suspect that the picture on the book jacket was probably better than mine. I'm not sure. I did, after the film, have an enormous amount of correspondence, but that was from all sorts of different aspects of the film, of which some of it was Ivor Novello. But no, I'd love to think I was a sort of darling of the country club set, but no.
One of the things we like to do on Musical Talk is hopefully open up new horizons in relation to musical theatre for some people who are interested. Is there an Ivor Novello song or a particular piece that you would recommend that somebody listens to as a good example? Yeah, what's your favourite, almost, is that question?
Oh, my favourite is not an original one. My favourite is Waltz of My Heart, which is why I was determined to get it into the film. Ivor Novello is, I think, someone you have to be in the mood for. And what he is part of is a tradition in show business which is rather lost now, which is that very sumptuous, very glamorous kind of show business, but not in the American glamour way. American glamour, which is film stars and that kind of thing, they still have to a certain extent, and you still see these glamorous stars on the red carpet and blah, blah, blah. But European show business glamour was a different thing. It was rather more sophisticated. And those people like, well, who are the great names?
Hildegard.
Well, yeah, sort of Anna. I was thinking more kind of Anna Neagle and, those. Who is that wonderful Vanessa Lee? And they were great ladies as well as being great stars, and they dressed beautifully, and it was very sophisticated and witty. And Noel Coward at the plays are very glamorous. Gertrude Lawrence was very glamorous, but in a sophisticated, aristocratic kind of glamour that is now out of fashion. And British show business has espoused the cause of the left and is fairly down at heel. And so You know, at our awards giving, it's always some woman in an evening frock wearing bother boots, you know. And I think that Novello answers that need. He's very undisappointing. But that's what it is. It's lush and glamorous and makes you cry. And I think if that's what you're after, then he's your tonic.
You could almost argue, and I'd be quite happy to be argued against this, but you could argue that Andrew Lloyd Webber is the nearest thing we have to, not as a personality, but the kind of shows are lush in a slightly more British tradition, and very nearly operetta. Although I accept that the parallels tend to drop off a little bit after that.
Well, yeah, but I agree with that, really. I mean, I think Phantom or something is a lush, romantic, glamorous show. No, I agree with that. I think he is the nearest we've got to that. But of course, he isn't backed up by the show business around it that he's operating in. He really is having to create an island of a kind of British glamour, you know, against all odds. Whereas there was a time when an opening of a Novello show, an opening of a Coward play, you know, was a great kind of society event, and everyone was in white fox and all that sort of stuff. And that's rather gone at the moment. It's funny that it's gone in a way, because of course you've recently got this tremendous resurgence of money, that there is a whole new Labour aristocracy who are richer than any class has been since before the First World War. But unfortunately for me, it hasn't really resulted in kind of haute couture. But some different things, all of them very worthwhile, I'm sure.
Musical Talk. Well, that was the wonderful Julian Fellowes in a most entertaining and enlightening interview, and that's only the first part of it. He was very generous with his time to me, and next week, when you listen to Musical Talk, you'll be able to hear the second part of that interview, when Julian will tell us all about his involvement with writing the book and beyond, in the collaborative creative process that ultimately resulted in Mary Poppins. I do hope you'll enjoy hearing that next week. But to conclude this episode, let's go back to the discussion I was having with Dr. Michael Williams, the author of Ivor Novello's Screen Idol, and let's hear a bit more about that important 20th century musical theatre giant, Ivor Novello. Michael, what's your take on Gosford Park?
Well, Gosford Park is interesting because, obviously, as we know, Novello was the only real-life, if you want to see it that way, figure within the film. And he does act as a kind of catalyst to what goes on there. As a real-life figure, a figure known, a figure that has resonance of that particular period, he's there as a kind of an anchor into the context, if you like. It kind of so many threads from the characters in the film weave towards him. And as we were saying earlier, this kind of figure of impossible romance that Novello embodies is there in the film itself in different ways.
For men and for women.
Indeed, yes. We see the second footman there that has a kind of a
Crush.
desire for Novello, very much so. And it is understated in the film. It's kind of there, but very subtly. The Land of Might Have Been is quite interesting anthemic song which appears at various points in the film. It is the tune you remember when you leave the film as well, as it carries with you as it kind of wistfully sort of drifts off into the ether at the end of the film. And that does have this quality of nostalgia, certainly, but it's the Land of Might Have Been. It's not something that actually exists. It's intangible again. It's a yearning for something, a sense of impossibility around it, just as for the second footman, he's a figure of impossible romance, because they have that gap between them, that scene that when Novello is playing at the piano and various people sort of gathering towards him, apart from Maggie Smith's character, the character that's transformed, very much the opposite, and very much more than background music, as she says. She's very disdainful of it and wants to distance herself from it, whereas other people are almost kind of magnetically drawn to Novello, who's there at the centre of the house by the piano. The music drifts through the house, you hear it below stairs. People start to form groups together and listen in different social spaces. They're stratified throughout the house in that way. And I believe, as Julian Fellowes has remarked, it shows the social divisions in the house at that time. Obviously, it's after the First World War, anticipating for us the one to come as well. The sense of this is a world that's going to dissipate and disappear. It is the land of might have been to some extent. There's a doomed quality to the more aristocratic characters in the film, the Countess of Trent and Maggie Smith's character, because she's so disdainful for this popular culture intruding into her world there. She wants to distance herself from it, and quite sort of vocally, very acerbically, in the dialogue that she has there.
No, don't. You'll just encourage him.
But in doing so, there's a kind of doomed sense in that she's not adapting to the modern world there. She's becoming ever further removed from it, in a way.
Time marches on, but she doesn't.
Yes, for those below stairs, and also the more middle class characters there that kind of sit with Novello at the piano, have a connection to it somehow. That's almost what's to come.
The poor wife, for example.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly. So you can see a division. You've got social history written via Novello within the whole household there. So it's quite interesting that he's there as a character that is impossibly romantic, but is entirely bound up with British social history from the last 20 years odd, really.
I mean, we're retconning that song, but I agree that that's what the film itself does that, doesn't it? And quite deliberately so. The choice of music in the films is quite interesting, I think, actually, because I think it showcases Ivor Novello quite well, because, as Julian Fellowes says in his interview, there aren't many comic numbers, there aren't many lively numbers in an Ivor Novello songbook. They're mostly sentimental ballads, after ballad, after ballad, after ballad, and you get a slightly wider range in the film. Not necessarily all of them being very funny. There's that one about being a duke, what a duke should be, which isn't tremendously fantastic, it has to be said. But my favourite song from the film, apart from the lovely Waltz of My Heart opening music, which is not done as a song but just as a opening theme instrumentally, is Why Isn't It You? Which once again is a Christopher Hassel lyric. And once, I suppose, in a way, you could say that touches on the here's the reality of the situation and here's the expectation of the situation. They don't tally. It's not a tremendously new idea for a song. It's been done a million times. But It's All Right With Me by Cole Porter touches on pretty much the same area, I think. But Gosford Park's very interesting. So perhaps we'll leave Gosford Park and we'll talk now about Ivor Novello's, almost his reputation and his legacy in terms of musical theatre. Because after the 20s, his film career peters out, essentially, doesn't he? He doesn't make the transition into talking films tremendously successfully. He has a rather strange speaking voice, doesn't he, in fact?
I mean, if you watch a film, something like Autumn Crocus, something from the early 30s, yes, as you say, it's a sound film, had come in by the late 20s. I think the last Rat film, Return of the Rat, had a synchronised sound version reissued shortly after the main feature came out. And Novello, I mean, he always said of his own singing voice, he stopped singing after a while, saying it sounded like a tired old bullfrog, so he kind of knew that wasn't his appeal and strayed away from it. And he's got, I mean, Katz described him as mellifluous. The name Ivor Novello has a kind of mellifluous quality, and Novello himself had obviously his Welsh accent is there, and when he's playing these, if you remember in the 20s, is this slightly exotic figure, because he has to chime in with the passion for Latin lovers, the Valentinos and
he's got an Italian surname.
Exactly, so he perfectly fits in with that. And the important thing about his appeal in the 20s, that sense of his international star appeal, was that there wasn't anyone else in Britain, in British cinema, that could compete with Valentino. Michael Balkan, who we know from Gainsborough Studios, said that
he was a film impresario.
Exactly, yes, said that he was an ambassador for British films at a time when ambassadors were few and far between, that he was almost unique in being able to appeal to American audiences, other audiences around the world as well. And so he has that unique quality in the 20s based on a slightly ambiguous ethnicity, in that if you look at reviews in America, they don't quite know where he comes from. He's either Welsh, Irish or Spanish, Italian. They kind of don't quite know, which is really important, because that's exactly the appeal of, because Navarro was Mexican but was seen to be kind of this very ambiguous category of the Latin lover. So everything about the 20s film and the silent, importantly silent film at the time, was that it was ambiguous, it was unspecified. As soon as he starts to speak, it becomes more specified. And he has this accent that somehow takes you on a grand tour around Europe.
It's a bit sing-songy, yes. Well, it always sounds Italian-Welsh to me, which is not necessarily the most lovely voice.
Yeah, and it does have that sing-song quality, because when you hear the records that were written at the time with him sort of introducing his songs, it does have that kind of meter to it when he's talking.
Whoa, mamma mia, look at you!
Yes, perhaps not quite that. So it does become a quality that maybe counteracts the main appeals of Novello.
I think it's a very disconcerting voice. It's not a voice I like. He is very pleasing on the eye, but he's not very pleasing on the ear.
Yes, and it almost is then becoming more of a parody of his appeal there as well towards the end, where you get a series of kind of Ruritanian settings with him there.
Now, what we moved on to here is, in fact, the last phase of his creative career, if you like, up to his death in 1951, where he wrote lots of what best termed reviews, musical operettas, really, I suppose, actually, in some senses, remembered now as being highly sentimental, review operetta kind of things, much more sentimental than was going on with the rest of British theatrical productions at the time. Noel Coward wasn't, after Bittersweet, Noel Coward wasn't doing that kind of thing. And indeed, really, Ivor Novello is, if you like, the last of the operettas, possibly until Andrew Lloyd Webber, if you want to get into that debate. But
and spectaculars as well. It's about the staging and the big effects, the liners going down and all of that.
Which is once again Lloyd Webber territory. And he was doing that in the 30s, 40s and indeed 50s, because he died whilst Gaze the Word, which was his last show, was actually still in production. Sorry, you were about to say that he'd moved on to this final phase.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the phases of Novello's career, you've got the boy chorister period, but then you've got the defining point of Keep the Home Fires Burning, which takes him into music and therefore into popular culture, and the fashioning of his image as well, which tailored into his film career, which begins 1919 in France, interestingly, then back in the UK, where it really boomed throughout the 20s. So he got the real film career, but at the same time as that, he's writing with Constance Collier The Rat, which spawned 3 films.
Successful films.
Very successful films.
And indeed, at the time of recording, one of them is about to be reshown at the National Film Theatre.
Indeed.
In London.
And that is The Triumph of The Rat, I believe, which is probably the best of the 3 films as well. It's a bit more playful, quite an interesting film. So you've got this kind of very, very successful film career in the 20s, in parallel with his stage writing career as well, and that he's writing, as I said, The Rat. So you've got that film career, but also always the stage versions of Novello's plays always include music. So it wasn't that it wasn't there in the 20s, it was. But then by the early 30s, his stage career in terms of musicals really picking up, and by around 1934, the year in which he stopped making films, I think he had 3 plays running simultaneously in the West End. So it was really starting off a kind of whole new trajectory of his career there, and there were attempts to bring him back to the film world, but he was very much then entrenched into theatre.
And that in many ways is the one area now where, if he's remembered outside the Ivor Novello Music Award, that he has any kind of sort of popular remembrance at all. And indeed has almost gone on to, you mentioned how he sort of parodies himself. He has in his own right become a parody since his untimely death. I mean, he was 54, he died of a heart attack in 1951. For many people, Hinge and Brackett were the last group of people who regularly sang his songs. And even then it was tinged with a kind of joke, wasn't it? I mean, would you care to explain how Novello's sort of reputation I won't say diminished, but was sort of hijacked, if you like?
Well, there is a sense that the image of Dear Ivor, as they refer to him, was, as you say, hijacked by the Dear Ladies themselves, and on their stage shows in particular, where they would sing Novello songs
and weep,
indeed. And it was as much about them and the characters they want to create as about Novello to some degree. And it doesn't, to some extent, it smooths over the edges that Novello might have had for earlier audiences.
Well, it paints him purely as a sentimental composer.
Indeed, but at the same time, they're using Novello's homosexuality to gain comedy for these female impersonations that they're producing themselves.
Yes, Hinge and Brackett, it ought to be said, are a cabaret act, mostly in the 70s to the 90s, who were 2 chaps who dressed as spinsters who lived together. They were ostensibly, one was an opera singer who had retired, and the other was her accompanist, and they had a kind of sort of love-hate relationship, tinged with a certain sense of possible lesbianism. The fact they were both gay actors and relatively well known, and I say, Ivor Novello was, if you like, cast retrospectively in a phantom sense as the unrequited love object, but. But that touches on a wider sense that, for some reason, and the discussion with Julian Fellowes touched upon this as well, that when Ivor Novello died in 1951, so did the progression of the interpretation of his work. He doesn't get revived. It's sort of died in the, whereas Coward has lived on beyond his death, if you pardon the expression, Ivor Novello hasn't. And he's now sort of pickled in a kind of sentimental aspect. He's sort of seen only as writing these sentimental things. When, as you say, there's rather more to him than that. And there's this sense that there's a whole body of people trying to protect his reputation and image, and in so doing have stopped his reputation and image ever developing. And so, in fact, it's actually now damaged beyond any kind of, hope of repair in some senses. And so it's a mixture of women of a certain age, probably most of whom would now be dead, but certainly up until the 70s and 80s, women of a certain age who have still held a torch for him. And a whole raft of men who were holding the estate, as I say, in sort of stasis.
Yeah, there's a whole number of things at play here. I mean, as we've discussed already, Novello was hugely successful and popular in the things he did during his lifetime, in the various stages of his career. Some of those things are exactly the right thing for their particular historical moment, and if you're unaware of those connections, and a film like Gosford Park almost tries to write them back in again, you kind of lose that sense of vitality.
Yes.
Having no reference towards him.
Which is a song that he wrote and was sung by Cicely Courtnidge, and
Indeed.
it's well worth catching because it's very good.
Very lively song. So there's that sense of kind of his connection which has been lost, but it's also the career decisions he made as well, in terms of he decided to focus on his stage career in the early 30s. He tried twice to have a film career in Hollywood. He went over first in 1923-24. He worked with D.W. Griffith there. Didn't quite work out, came back, and then he tried again in the early 30s. But there is a sense that Hollywood didn't quite know what to do and what kind of roles to cast him in. And he ended up working for MGM writing dialogue, including for Tarzan the Ape Man. And the often misquoted me, Tarzan you Jane line, you can link to Novello, which is not a connection you would expect necessarily.
So he wrote that, or is it at least attributed?
Indeed, yeah, and if you look at the titles of the film, you'll see his name pop up there. That didn't quite work out. So there is a kind of sense of misfiring in the early 30s in terms of the film work. Some of it is very interesting, worth catching. Some of it, as we were saying earlier, is a bit of a pastiche of what he was before in the 20s. That could have maybe resolved itself, but he made a decision to work on the stage, as evidently that was working so well. So in 1934 he goes to the stage. So it's a career decision not to work in film. Whereas if you look at someone, there is a quite easy connection to maybe with Coward, which works sometimes, but maybe it's not always worth pursuing entirely the Coward link there. But
the difference between him and Novello in some ways is that because Novello couldn't sing and had a slightly odd voice, he was slightly closed off to some of the talking opportunities, radio, film, television. Whereas Coward could perform his own materials, as you say. I mean, that's not to say that Ivor Novello didn't perform, because he did turn up in all his own shows. They were written around a non-singing central character, Playboy, Ivor Novello.
Exactly. I mean, you read the reviews and look at it, it's entirely important that he should be there on stage as well, because he had a performance that worked, but it wasn't a kind of acerbic wit.
No.
It could be put on the page and quite easily worked for other generations as well. It worked very much for its own time. It's a different kind of performance there, and therefore as he kind of removed himself from the film world, unlike Coward, who kept working within it. Coward then went on, 1969, The Italian Job, to create this kind of reworked image of himself, this parody. Bunny Lake is Missing, another British film where he appears as this collector objet d'art. It's very much, again, the same image being reworked there. So there is a kind of typecasting that Coward put himself in that worked for those films. It could easily exportable for American audiences as well. So all that was removed from Novello, both by decision and by his death in 1951 as well, because of so much what Novello did was about an idea of Britishness and nostalgia and the stage, and also in his film as well, which wasn't looked upon kindly in certain periods, and also the silent films as well. It's only in the last 20 years that particularly British silent film has been reassessed and revisited. So again, there's a whole level of prejudice there that has to be worked around before you get to Novello and rediscover him. In
many ways, then, I suppose what we're saying is that that Ivor Novello suffered in the same way that Noel Coward did in the 60s, in some sense, at least in Britain. But there was a backlash against what was seen as middle-class theatre. Terence Rattigan suffers, Coward suffers, and posthumously, Ivor Novello suffers. Except that he doesn't live long enough because he's already dead to get through the other end of it.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes, because Coward was able to do that. That's very interesting. So, touching briefly upon his operettas, which are, if you like, the last phase, as we've discussed, there's The Dancing Years, which is possibly the most successful. That's the 1939 one. But there's also Gaze the Word, Perchance to Dream. And he built up a little repertory company, didn't he, of people around him. There were people like Olive Gray, Zena Dare, and I believe Margaret Rutherford and Joyce Grenfell were also huge fans, and were in his, if you like, coterie, would appear in his shows. He died of a heart attack in 1951, and very quickly his sort of reputation disappeared, and now almost entirely the remembrance of him has disappeared. But if I were to ask you, can you name a few songs that people might have heard of? We've touched Home Fires Burning, we've mentioned And Her Mother Came Too, Waltz of My Heart was in Gosford Park, as was The Land That Might Have Been.
I mean, Keep the Home Fires Burning will be perhaps the song that's best remembered, although followed close on by another war song in We'll Gather Lilacs.
And that's really one of those songs that periodically is revived, in fact.
Yes, probably next to Home Fires is probably the one you're most likely to hear being used. Again, often to evoke the context as well, the kind of the wartime setting.
And you get that gets performed in lots of bizarre different ways. I mean, in the 1980s, it actually re-entered the hit parade, ladies and gentlemen, the charts, when Simon May, who's the composer of the EastEnders theme tune, and his orchestra, which you could still do in the 1980s, had a hit with it.
And I think Cerys Matthews from Catatonia has also recorded it.
And there's
a slightly different version of it. You'll hear it's not quite how Novello
would have
anticipated, perhaps.
But it's a song that has survived. Now, we've touched a great deal on Ivor Novello's career, and I'm extremely grateful to you. Thank you. In your view, is Ivor Novello important in the 20th century?
Well, I think it is important because he's, in terms of the theatre, he's one of the key figures in the 20th century. Moving through the various stage through the 1910s into the 20s, 30s, you can chart the progression of lots of the way music was used in theatre in different forms there as well, and the whole Ruritanian romance, the lush, spectacular dramas that he produced. He's an important figure in that way. He's important culturally, in terms of his connection to the First World War, for Keep the Home Fires Burning, a resonance that he kept through his career. He was the biggest star of British cinema in the 1920s, and also at that time the first major star in British film. You've got Betty Balfour as well, keeping the female side up as well, but it's very much Novello was the exportable image of British film at the time. And that's something that gets neglected, even though he worked with directors such as D.W. Griffith, Alfred Hitchcock as well. Graham Katz is another interesting director that gets overlooked sometimes. So he taps into a lot of different worlds through music, through film, drama. He is very important in that way. Important as a figure, as a connecting figure. It's about, as we said before, this sense of nostalgia, hope, possibility. He's kind of always at the middle of these things, that these slightly ill-defined concepts sometimes. Obviously, his sexuality is interesting as a... Obviously, think about the period in which he's working in the 1920s. The Oscar Wilde trials weren't that long ago, really. So in terms of the way that sexuality could be represented on screen, he's quite interesting in that way, which Coward does in other ways as well on the stage. So he's interesting for that. So he's interesting as a social figure through various different contexts, and he's a way into those particular periods. He represents possibilities, connections and impossibilities, which make him intriguing and interesting, and much more than perhaps he would initially appear. There was an interview that described him as essentially modern, which I thought was interesting, because it's not what you would think of initially, that there's always a currency to Novello in any given moment that perhaps is kind of overlooked these days. So if we see him as an essentially modern figure at the same time as being this nostalgic, impossibly romantic figure, I think there's a kernel of intrigue there to pursue.
Lovely. Dr. Williams, Michael, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Ruritania, the moment delights of glamorous nights no longer constitute a raving mania in Ruritania. Ruritania, rhapsodical kings no longer are things to sing about in Greece or in Albania or Ruritania. Our nights are now considered no longer glamorous. The only fellow is Ivor Novello, who still believes in us. Ruritania, as nobody cares for foreign affairs, we're going rather swiftly down the drain, yeah. In Ruritania, in Ruritania.
Well, that was Dr. Michael Williams, and if you're interested in reading more about Ivor Novello, particularly in his early part of the career, you can do so in his book Ivor Novello, Screen Idol, from the British Film Institute, BFI. Now, that's it for this episode of Musical Talk. I do hope you enjoyed it. Remember, do go to our website, www.musicaltalk, that's one word, .co.uk. Tune in again next week and you'll hear the ego of various Musical Talk presenters battling their way to the microphone just to make sure that you get your fix of musical talking. Speak to you then. This has been a Musical Talk production, copyright 2008. And here are some musical out talks. Right. Are you happy giving me a level?
Is there anything particularly you'd like me to say for this level? Is that enough?
That's about right. Do you want to get a little closer?
No.
He'll be talking about his creative involvement with Styles and Drew on Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the stage musical. No, he's not, because he did Mary Poppins. I've got it in my head for some reason that Julian Fellowes did Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. I said it to him as well, and he corrected me on the day. It's very embarrassing. He's the author of the book Ivor Novello, Screen Idol. That's right, isn't it?
That is right.
Okay, and he built up a little repertory company, didn't he, of people around him. There were people like Olive Gray, Zena Dare, and I believe Margaret Rutherford and Joyce Grenfell were also huge fans, and were in his, if you like, coterie, would appear in his shows. So, what can you tell us about those? Nothing at all.
Nothing.
Fine. Well, I mean, so...
To say, we want this to be a happy experience for
Okay,
you.
yeah.
And obviously, the more relaxed you feel, the better it is for the listeners.
Well, I mean, just don't use anything when I sound a complete prick.
I'm sure that won't happen. But they've been primed by me to expect me to be one, so... splendid. Well, if you're happy...
For Novello, to be honest, what is this bang, bang, bang? I better explain it on the soundtrack. The bang, bang, bang is not happening in this flat. I think it's builders chucking rubbish away. I've lost my thread there. I can't remember what I was saying.
You were saying that he wasn't one of the great creeps, shall we say,
No,
like Howard, perhaps.
He wasn't how much they need to be changed. Oh, my God!
As long as the building's not on fire, that's fine.
That will be in the final edit. Hello? Oh, darling, I'm right in the middle of an interview in my flat. Yes. Okay. Bye. Now, I'd love to say I can turn this off, but I don't know how to turn it off, so we'll have to have that as a natural break.
That's perfectly fine. We edit these anyway, and it's...
Anyway, that's that. We finished that, really. The show needed to be a family show. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
Hello? Hello? Pammy, darling. I'm very, very good. But I'm doing an interview at the moment. And Emma's in Dorset. No, she's down there with Peregrine, darling. I will go back to my interviewer, who's looking very cross. Talk to you soon. Bye.
I'm so sorry.
You said the sentence you were in was the show needed to be a family.
Disney film, the problems are essentially Disney-esque, with the run on the bank and all this stuff. Whereas
that would never happen in real life, would it?
Well, no, not quite in that way. But and then you create a really problematical area.
Just for clarity, we're referring to George the father,
George the father,
and not George Styles.
No. George Styles' private life is a model for us all. But no.
That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much.
Are you okay? Have you got what you want?
Yes. I hope it wasn't too awful for you.
No, I don't mind. No. Let's get this stuff down.
No more musicals.
Play when I'm dead.